A new report by Human Rights Watch says African refugees in Israel are being denied access to fair and efficient asylum procedures. In December, the Israeli parliament passed a measure to indefinitely incarcerate migrants at a detention center. Last week, in a groundbreaking decision, the Supreme Court of Israel ruled to close that facility. One judge said the measure was, quote, disproportionate and unconstitutional. He said it, quote, negates one's right to freedom and hurts one's right to dignity. But Israel's interior minister, who oversees the detention center, has denounced the ruling as, quote, a mistake that leaves Israel without the tools to handle illegal infiltration. He's urged the government to consider amending the law, which would restrict the court's authority in such policies. Well, joining us now to talk about that, to discuss Israel's immigration policies, I'm joined by Israeli diplomat Paul Hertzen. He joins us from Jerusalem. And Mr. Hertzen, thanks for joining us. Some serious allegations against Israel there, that it is violating international law, that it is disregarding international conventions to which it is a party. And now, of course, you have the High Court, which is saying that that detention center is illegal. So what happens next? I mean, are you going to shut it down? Are you in the process of shutting it down?
Well, two things, if I may. First of all, just a word on the side about Human Rights Watch, which regularly uses Israel as a fundraising tool and a public relations stunt, goes down to Saudi Arabia to raise money in order to monitor Israel, a rather cheap, dark and lazy way of monitoring human rights. So they don't have very much credibility. But to the substance of the issue, which is an interesting and an important issue, over the course of the last 7 years, Israel has received and hosted some 60,000 illegal migrants, economic migrants from Africa. You have to remember, Israel is the only place that you can leave Africa from overland. It is the single most attractive destination for people looking for a better life. Not always life is that pleasant and easy. They've been in Israel, tens of thousands of people, mostly, as you mentioned, from Sudan and from Eritrea for some years now. They've worked here, they've lived here, they've got health care, their children have had education, they've earned a lot of money. But the truth of the matter is that almost none of them have asked for refugee status. Even fewer are actually entitled under international law to refugee status. And the time has come for them to really go home. The situation in Sudan, the situation in Eritrea may not be as nice as Israel. I'm not pretending that it is, but it's stabilized. It's much better than it was before. And all of us around the world who are receiving illegal migrants, who are receiving economic migrants, are facing what's not an easy issue. I think Israel has addressed it very well. I think Israel has addressed it with difficulty, better than most. And we have at the same time an internal democratic conversation going on about what is the correct policy. As you mentioned, the courts have intervened and we're moving forward. But thus far, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think some 15% have gone back home and we're moving ahead with that.
You know, you say Israel has handled it very well, but even the Israeli High Court doesn't think that you've handled it very well.
Well, I said relatively well. I don't think it's an easy issue. And I think that the High Court has come in on one angle, one out of 10, 15 different policies that have been implemented to try and address this. Look, you have to understand, okay, not only Israel, but Europe, the United States, other places in the world, we're all facing this issue. And the truth of the matter is this: it doesn't matter in theory if another 15 million people were to leave Africa and walk their way through many other countries, all of which they could stay in if they really were refugees as opposed to economic migrants, and find their way to Israel, even were theoretically there to be a way for that many people to earn a living here, okay? That is not going to make any significant difference whatsoever to the issues that exist in Africa. The real resolution to the issues of Africa is increased investment in sustainable development back home. That's where we, Israel, and the rest of the world need to do more, and we are doing a lot. There are over 250,000 Africans who we have brought 250,000, who we have brought to Israel for training in agriculture, in banking, in healthcare, in women's rights, in running businesses, in order to go back and uplift themselves. That's the real solution to this issue. In the meantime, because of the particular situation that existed in Sudan and in Eritrea, as opposed to other countries in Africa, we've had people who haven't been able to go home. Today, the situation is different. You can look at what's going on in Europe. They're almost all of them sending Sudanese back to Sudan. We have an issue there because, of course, we don't have diplomatic relations with Sudan. So there's a political issue there. But there's no reason whatsoever for people not to go home.
Okay, you say the real solution would be for these countries to build up their resources, build up their economy so they can accommodate the people in those countries. But the reality is, and we look at one of the...
And for us, for those of us, Israel, other members of the OECD, to increase our investment in sustainable development in Africa and elsewhere.
Okay, but the reality right now is that they are in Israel and they are seeking refuge in Israel. And let's look at one of the specific accusations made by Human Rights Watch. It says that Israel is illegally coercing up to 7,000 refugees, Eritreans and Sudanese, into leaving the country, and that they've been denied access to fair and efficient asylum policies and detained unlawfully. And you would say?
I would say that just because this NGO, who's using us to raise funds for themselves, says something doesn't mean it's so. I would say to you that Israel is a signatory, one of the first signatories on the Convention of Refugees. We implement it not only to the letter but also in the spirit. Every single person, very few of whom, by the way, but every single person who has applied for refugee status has gone through the procedure, through the relevant checks, through the interviews. Some, I acknowledge, not too many, but some have been given refugee status. But the truth of the matter is the vast majority of them don't even apply for refugee status because they know they're not entitled to it. They are coming to Israel, and I understand why. Israel is perhaps the most exciting venture of the 21st century and also happens to be the only place you can leave Africa from by, overland, as opposed to by boat or plane. And they're coming to look for a better life. That is something which Israel has provided them with for some years now. And they have earned money and they have saved money, and they are in a position where their own countries are now far more stable than they were, where they can go home and build their lives back with their families.
Right, okay, there may be some who are coming to Israel for economic reasons, as economic refugees, but there are many who are coming to Israel because they face persecution in their own countries. So isn't there a humanitarian argument for letting them stay in Israel, seeing that they face these threats? I mean, we have an instance here of 3 people being sent to Sudan. One was tortured when he got back. Another was placed in solitary confinement. A third was charged with treason.
Well, this is what I can say. You're 100% correct that there are cases, there are not many cases, but there are cases of people who are entitled to refugee status under the Convention of Refugees, and they have received it. I am not aware. Just yesterday, because I knew we were going to have this conversation, I spoke to our ambassador to Eritrea. As I say, we don't have relations with Sudan. I spoke to our ambassador in Eritrea, and he said to me that there are several thousand Eritreans who have gone back voluntarily. We're not forcing anybody to go home, not anybody. There are several thousand Eritreans who've gone home. He hasn't heard of a single case of there being any issues. Now you mentioned Sudan, and what's interesting here is the reverse side, the other side of the coin that you just put on the table here, and that is that Sudan is a country which regards Israel as an enemy. Sudan is a country which has aided other countries and other terrorist organizations in securing arms in order to attack Israel, and we have thousands of Sudanese who have found their way to Israel. The question is not so much what happens to them when they go home. The question is what happens to us when they come here. And they have come here, they've worked, they've been well treated. There haven't been any cases that I know of. I mean, look, let's not pretend that it's a perfect world, okay? But when it gets down to the law, not necessarily to individual relationships, there are no cases I know of them suffering here in Israel any violation of a very high standard standard which we demand of ourselves. You mentioned a couple of cases. I'm not aware of them. I'm willing to check them. If it comes from Human Rights Watch, I would take it with a grain of salt. The veracity of their statements when it comes to Israel is questionable at best.
Okay, I will allow Human Rights Watch to defend itself. But if we look at what has happened on the legal side in Israel, I mean, as I mentioned, you have the High Court, which has ruled the detention center illegal. Also, a year ago, the justices overruled legislation that permitted migrants to be jailed for up to 3 years without trial. It would appear that as far as the legal argument is going in Israel, the government is on the losing side. And the question I want to ask you is, what is the significance of these court decisions on Israel's immigration policies?
Well, these are not about immigration policies, because these are not immigrants to Israel. But the question is legitimate. Look, there's a string of policies the government has taken, one of which, of course, is to build a physical border fence between ourselves and Egypt through which they're coming, and that's significantly reduced the number of people who've come to Israel. There's been a crackdown on Israelis who are illegally employing people, and because these people are not here legally, they're not entitled to protection under the labor laws, or they're entitled to protection, but the employers don't necessarily always abide by it. And there is, as you say, not a detention center, it's an open facility. They can come and go as they want, but they have to sleep there. The courts have ruled that one out of many steps the government has taken is not in the spirit of our laws for the protection of human rights, not anybody else's laws. And this is part of the democratic conversation that happens in Israel. The government will obviously accept what the court has ruled, and the government will adjust itself. One out of many policies. I think that it's part of the beauty that is Israel, and not only Israel, other countries, some other countries as well, that there are checks and balances, that you don't just have an executive authority which comes and does whatever it wants. The public has elections, and the courts come along, and I think that's part of the beauty of Israel, that we do have these checks and balances.
One final question, Mr. Hudson, and that is, Israel grants automatic citizenship to those people who follow the Jewish faith, but not to people who follow other faiths, or in fact follow no faith at all. Isn't that religious discrimination?
Well, of course, you're making the assumption that Judaism is a religion, when the truth of the matter is that the Jews are a tribe or a nation, a people. We have a religion. You must remember, we are native to this land. We've had an attachment for 3,000-4,000 years to this land. And what you're talking about are my people, including, by the way, tens of thousands of Jews from Africa, from Ethiopia, who have come to Israel and have received citizenship and been integrated into our society over here. What you're saying to me here is that Greece would be wrong to accept Greeks coming back home, or that Japan would be wrong to accept Japanese or Guatemala, etc., to accept their people coming back home. That doesn't make any sense.
But I guess they base it on nationality, and you're basing it on religion, aren't you?
No. I said to you, I'm basing it on nationality. We are a people just like the Greeks and the Guatemalans and the Chinese. We happen to also have a religion, but this is not religious based. I'm a secular guy. That doesn't mean I'm not a Jew.
Okay, so we're going to have to leave it there. Paul Hudson, thanks for joining us.